Hey, John Gilroy here. In the next 30 minutes, we will record an interview with an intergalactic CTO. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Today, we're going to talk about how the federal government can control data in motion, and our intergalactic guest is none other than Will Laforest, Field CTO for Confluent. And of course, I had that facetious opening there, but it's probably appropriate for your title. I mean, you're way beyond just the United States. Maybe you are intergalactic. So what's your real role there?
Well, yeah, quite a career trajectory. If you look at my LinkedIn profile, I had some fun there. So I was the head fry chef at McDonald's, and now
I saw that.
Yes. But that said, there's some truth, right? I work with a number of customers that have non-terrestrial projects using Confluent and Kafka, and we talked about one, right?
Right. Let's look at NASA. I mean, they got all these satellites going around, and if it's data in motion, if that's your stick, well, then that's the data in motion, buddy. A LEO satellite goes 17,500 miles an hour. So we're going to top that for data in motion. Can you top that?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we got Mission to Mars was using data in motion, right? So.
I talked to Vince Cerf, and he's working on deep space communication to Mars. Yeah. And I said, Vint, what's the biggest problem you have? He said, well, the biggest problem I have is speed of light is too slow.
That's a pretty big problem.
When you got a problem like that, you're the big boys. It's like, oh, this isn't the minor leagues anymore. This is the Brainiac class. So great. Yeah. Speaking of Brainiacs, there's this little minor thing in the federal government called the Federal Data Strategy. Probably not important for my listeners. It may be important maybe once or twice a year. And if you look at that from 2021, they have very specific goals. And, we're not going to go into details on it, but in general, I think what they want the federal government people to do is to create, consume, and share data. Sounds so easy, doesn't it? So toss to you, Will. You got the next 4 hours.
Woohoo! We'll have it solved by then, John. No problem.
Yeah, you solved by then. So where does Confluent fit in this picture?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, just a comment on federal data strategy. I as much as I'd love to say that Confluent or any technology could help solve the bulk of those problems, most of that strategy, if you look at it, is sort of socio-cultural in nature, and that's very appropriate. If you look at sort of the newer like data mesh, I like to talk about data mesh a lot because whereas some of the older data architectures didn't really talk about the social cultural aspect, that is a huge part of data mesh. And so, yeah, you got to get that right. But if you step beyond that aspect, the whole point of data in motion, of Kafka, is to essentially decouple data producers from people who want the data and enable them to receive that data in real time. Simply put.
Let's paint the picture here. I come from a liberal arts background, and when I first heard MFA, I thought that was a Master in Fine Arts. And when I talked to you a couple of years ago, when I heard Kafka, I said, oh boy, we're talking about some crazy novelist here. But let's tell the audience what Kafka is, because your company is known as this source company behind Apache Kafka. Maybe paint that picture, and we'll go into data.
Yeah, and before that, I'm going to give your listeners a little tidbit of information that most people don't know. And that is the person who created Kafka at LinkedIn, Jay Krebs, who's our CEO now. Before he made Apache Kafka, he had another project with another great literary figure called Voldemort. So there's a database out there called Voldemort. I think he up-leveled his naming when he moved to the next project. But
well, this is a good place to work. You got Fry Chef, you got Intergalactic CTO, you got Voldemort. Oh, that's the name that can't. Oh, you said it. You can't say that name. That's a problem right there.
Shoot. Yeah.
So Kafka. So you're at a baseball game in Vienna, and someone says, "Oh, what's Kafka?" So what do you say?
Well, I'll say something along the lines of what I said earlier, which is, but I'll give you a little bit more detail, a little bit more flesh on the bone. So Kafka was originally created at LinkedIn by our founders in 2010 as a way to enable data to flow in real time across systems in the organization, right? That was the problem they were trying to tackle. And it was open sourced in 2010. And eventually in 2014, the founders left to create Confluent because the adoption was so huge, right? So like their day job of answering questions on the help forums, it just didn't scale anymore. So, and really that's the idea, real-time data flow from producers to consumers. The analogy for someone who's not technical that I find that resonates the most is Uber or really any of the rideshare platforms. So if you think about it, what happens there is an Uber driver's driving around, or Lyft, or pick your flavor. Every time as they move along, they're sending a constant stream of events. They're saying, hey, I'm Writer Joe, I'm at this spot. Now I'm at this spot. Now I'm at this spot. It's a sequence of events. It's a stream of events. And what Uber does is it publishes that. And then all these independent processes in the background can do things like, for instance, match it with another stream of data. So we as writers are constantly publishing data. Hey, I'm Will. I'm at Caboose Brewery in Vienna, right? I need a ride. So I'm publishing those events. And so the whole point of data streaming is to take multiple streams of data, handle it in real time as it's occurring, and do whatever you need. In the case of Uber, it's matching riders with drivers, right? But it's also taking those same streams of data and doing other things like that with them. Like, for instance, computing how you want to do pricing on a minute by minute basis, right? The whole point is when you publish that stream of data, you don't need to know or care what the consumers are going to do with it. And this really unleashes sort of a lot of innovation, right? It's this decoupling nature that's very, very powerful.
And it almost seems like it was a perfect storm. Way back in 2010, when I was in high school, this was kind of an innovative concept. But look around today. We've got, 15 billion IoT devices? We got them in the satellites. NASA knows that. We got them on railroad tracks. We probably got them in your backyard, in your car, everywhere. And so all of a sudden, the whole idea of understanding data in motion, when you get in your Tesla and drive down the street, that's a lot of data coming in motion, So it's almost like he was either prescient or lucky, or he caught the wave early, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Great examples. Tesla, if you think about it, they have like 60 sensors in that vessel. They are well-known, huge users of Kafka. Pretty much all the automotive industry is. Any IoT device, inevitably, when it's sending those events, I would say 90% of the time it's going to Kafka somewhere, right? So yeah, you're right on the money.
So the business model for Confluent, CONFLUENT.io. So your business model is to partner with another consultant, partner with an organization, maybe someone at Carasoft, or what's your typical engagement model with the federal government, Will?
As we all know, the federal government works a little bit different than you might see in industry. So typically, we will have a services partner doing building large scale projects. So, we're a software vendor. We provide a platform, and there's really two options. One is what we'd call a self-managed platform that you can run on-prem or you can run in the cloud, but you're managing it yourself. And then the second thing we offer is a fully managed Confluent cloud offering. So that's serverless. You say, I want to use Kafka. We take care of all the work behind the scenes to provision it. And you don't need to know or care about servers. And I think that's early stages in the government right now because we're going through our FedRAMP process. But even still, we have some users of our managed service in government. But that's really where industry is going. So
can we say that Linux is to Red Hat as Apache is to Confluent? Is that a good parallel there?
Yeah, I would say so. Although I think nowadays we very much, and if you look at like Wall Street, they very much view us as a cloud company. So more akin to like the Snowflakes and the Databricks of the world.
Yeah.
But we did. I mean, that was our DNA. That's how we started off, right? When Jay and June and Neha founded Confluent, we were providing support for Apache Kafka, but there's just a lot more that's needed for our customers to fully, harness the power of data streaming. So that's when we started adding in all these other capabilities, and then everyone wants it managed in the cloud. So nowadays we're usually sort of put in that category with Snowflake and MongoDB and Databricks, et cetera.
I started off by talking about the federal data strategy. There's another organization that a lot of people think is important called the OMB. Mm-hmm. And if you look what the OMB has to say about data and data in motion, data storage, they have this long-term plans, and I like a vision, like having the flag in front of the troops. And the long-term vision is to accelerate the value of data, and they want federal users to optimize self-service and use data analytic capabilities. And so now that guy at LinkedIn 10, 15 years ago, I don't know how he read its stars, but this seems like it could have been in your mission statement 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of the beauty of the open source world to a certain degree, John. It's like, what LinkedIn created it for was one thing, but we released it and all of a sudden you see all these use cases just developing out there in the community. And rather than us trying to say, okay, we're going to try and guess where the puck's going, and that does happen, we have the community tell us where the puck's going, right? Because they're doing this stuff, right? So, I mean, I think that, again, that's sort of a founding principle of companies that start with open source like we did. So
there's a marketing book out called They Ask, You Answer. And it's the best, most efficient way to build a product is to find out what the people need. And when you talk about LinkedIn and the forums are filled with questions, it makes a transition to this. And I think what you're doing is you're keeping maybe ahead of the curve or right on top of the curve. When it comes to data, if you go to Google Trends, the trending phrase is going to be zero trust. We know that. Okay, we know that. Everyone knows that. Yeah. And so I'm trying to think of what role would you play with this whole concept of zero trust, but you're almost the truck that delivers the eggs to the warehouse. You're not worrying about the eggs being protected in there. So you're like a vehicle more than any kind of protection in the data. Are you?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think our role in zero trust, and I'll be the first to tell you I'm not a zero trust expert, but I think our role there is very much in terms of the cybersecurity angle, which is part of the strategy is to constantly collect telemetry and events that are happening in your enterprise and look for these threat patterns, right? And if you look in government, for instance, the cyber defense is probably still the biggest use case that Apache Kafka and cyber has. Like DoD, for instance, there's not a single major cyber defense program that isn't using Kafka or Confluent. Every single one of them is. In the IC, it's being used. In civilian, it's being used. So although that's really sort of, I would say, independent, if you're doing zero trust or not doing zero trust, you still need cybersecurity. You still need to collect this sort of information. But it is a part of a full zero trust strategy, is considering how you're going to look at the sources of data. And of course, the faster you find threats and discover problems, the better job you can do of mitigating and shutting things down. So the real-time data processing in Kafka is highly useful there.
Well, you just hit the phrase that pays. And I was listening to an interview by a colleague of yours. His name is Jason Schick. And he used a phrase I've never interviewed an intergalactic CTO, but I've never heard the phrase change data from being passive to active.
Yeah.
And that's innovation. I never thought of that. Maybe that's what happens is if there's an event and it can be sensed, all of a sudden the person who's responsible for reacting can be notified of that, huh?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I'm an old database guy. And so took me a while to get my head wrapped around this. But really the idea is like the traditional model of working with data is you'd get some events, you'd stuff them in a database someplace. And then what you would do is ask questions of them or analyze them, right? But there's a certain inherent latency in doing that. And instead, with data streaming, what you do is you're inverting the whole relationship. So instead of like bringing the questions and the analytics to a big pile of data sitting somewhere, you're actually bringing the data to the questions analytics, and they're constantly continuously operating on it. So that's exactly the point.
You probably remember years ago when you'd see job average, DBA Oracle, database. It's almost like a historian. And history's great. Who doesn't love history? But if there's a malicious actor out there, you don't want to be you want to be in more of a linebacker type approach where you stop it. And so maybe this is a different way to look at data rather than something that you put in the shelf, and next Wednesday at 9 a.m., you come in with a cup of coffee and you review it. Oh, wait, you could have lost the fight by then.
Well, yeah. I mean, you probably saw that Gartner paper about perishable insights, right? And essentially what they say is the value of the data is proportional to its freshness, right? The fresher the data is, the more valuable it is. And that was a really hard thing to tackle, sort of the traditional data technologies, whether it be an operational database or you're throwing it into a data lake. It still goes through this process of like storing and then periodically running queries. And even if you make those queries really, really fast, it's still too slow. I will say, I'll be the first to tell you, like, databases are not going anywhere. We still need the historical ability to do forensic analysis, to do analytics on historical data. But now the view, I think, is that the world needs both the real-time data processing as well as the historical.
And it's really not just for a malicious actor. It could be for Will Laforest applying for some kind of a FEMA grant from a flood, or it could be John Gilroy applying for some kind of a grant from NIH for research. I mean, what the person is expected to do is gather sources of information from wide, and to improve citizen service, that speed needs to be improved. So we have to take in and find a more effective way to use the data rather than as a historical asset.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, just, double click on something you said. Like, oftentimes people will say, I don't actually have a real-time data problem. Like, I can look at historical data. Time's not really an issue. But what's sort of been discovered is that just in terms of, I would say, first as customers, and now we view it from the lens of citizens, there is a desire across governments to improve citizen engagement. And a big part of that is the experience of how you're interacting and what processes look like. If you look at all the most innovative companies, they're all applying this event-driven, asynchronous, very, very fast way of interacting with customers. So if I go back to the use case that you just talked about, I'm submitting a grant. You ask any person, they'd say, well, why do I care how fast that process takes place? And the answer is because that process is not really one process. It's a lot of little steps that creates friction between you, the person submitting the application, and the people that are processing. So customs and CIS, DHS CIS, is a big user of Confluent and event-driven architectures. But most of the processes, if you think about it, are, I'm submitting an application, I'm going to do some investigation, et cetera. So you wouldn't necessarily understand how valuable that is until you start seeing where it makes a difference.
I have a ton of different questions, but we're running out of time here. I want to talk about data mesh. I want to talk about low coupling, but I'm not going to bore the audience with that. Just want to close out. Maybe next time, Will. But give us a crystal ball here. If the founder of your company had a pretty good crystal ball back in 2011, why don't you go steal that from him and peer into the crystal ball and tell me about the next 5 years with, event-driven systems?
Yeah, I think as great as the adoption has been, as powerful as it's been, the companies that have been able to most effectively use it have had large engineering teams and huge budgets. And God, we know there's a lot of that in the government, but I think what we're going to see happen is that it's going to become easier and easier to do data streaming and event-driven architectures. And some of the things that were sort of bolt-ons or you had to manage yourself are now being fully managed and are getting closer to the data, such that I can do this powerful real-time streaming analytics without ever having to write a line of code, right? So we just recently made a huge investment in something called Flink, which has a similar adoption curve to Kafka, maybe just 4 years later. And that is going to really be sort of the foundation by which people can operate on the data, not just send and receive the data, but actually operating the data in flight rather than sort of having to build that themselves. And so I think that's going to make a huge difference in terms of the adoption and time to value, right? Even when you don't have huge engineering staffs like the government does, or Uber does, or LinkedIn, or Instacart, or whoever, right? So,
and I was just thinking of tying this with zero trust. Well, the first pillar of zero trust is identity. And so if Will Laforest tries to get into the DoD, well, it has to be identified. And so if it's General Laforest, he doesn't want to wait. I mean, there's no way. And so any way you can speed up that process, it'll improve citizen services. It improves services for the DoD. It goes right on down. So this speed isn't necessarily a bad factor to focus in on. Well, unfortunately, Will, we're running out of time here. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I thank my guest, Will Laforest, Field CTO of Confluent.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.